Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, Museum in the Streets. Today's session is a story and a how-to guide. First, we have the story of a collaboration between a creative museum team and some teachers, including me. The result was a fifth grade class who planned and launched a series of activations or museum-like experiences to engage their community at DC's African American Civil War Memorial, as well as a nearby elementary school. After our story, we have a how-to guide, and you can adapt the steps we use to support your own students in planning and launching their own activations in your communities. With some support from you, they'll be ready to create their own Museum in the Streets experiences. We'd like to introduce ourselves as today's presenters and then jump right into our story and our how-to guide. I'm Alison Gillmeister, a middle school teacher here in Washington, D.C., and this is Andrea Jones, Associate Director of Education at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. Before we tell you more, just a few reminders. First, a recorded version of this session will be available in a few days. Session organizers will email you directions for accessing it. Already, you can find these slides and resources that will help you with the strategies we're going to share today in a link above the video feed where you joined this session. Second, if you're on Twitter and Instagram, you can also connect with us there. You'll see our handles in the slides that follow. And during today's session, feel free to use the hashtag Museum in the Streets to extend the conversation. It's on the previous slide if you're able to show that, our hashtag. Lastly, we don't need to wait until after the session to hear from you. We'd love to hear from you as the session unfolds. We have a Q&A feature moderated by Dwayne Lawson-Brown, who is a member of the Anacostia Community Museum team. We'll pose a few structured opportunities to use the Q&A throughout, and we also hope to share answers to some of your questions via our social media after the presentation. Now, our real introductions start, and then Andrea will take us right into the activations. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a middle school teacher in Washington, D.C., and I'm also the co-founder of Capital Experience Lab, or CapX for short. You can see more about CapX on the next slide. CapX is a school model designed to make school more engaging and learning more sticky, while also preparing students for navigating diverse environments in life outside the classroom. We weave community-based experiences into the school day as part of a project-based learning curriculum. In order to bring those types of experiences into the school day, we collaborate with all sorts of community members, including folks who work at museums, like my co-presenter, Andrea. I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself and the work that she's done with some of her colleagues.
All right, so if you could go back to the last slide. So like Alison said, I am the Associate Director of Education at Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. And early in 2020, I joined with 5 other museum colleagues to found an initiative that we called Free the Museum, which was essentially a call to action to encourage museums to quickly adapt and to take their work to the streets. When I began at the museum later that year, I brought that mentality with me, as you'll see today. And as a side note, I taught high school social studies in Atlanta for 7 years earlier in my career. So I have a super soft spot in my heart for relationships with schools and teachers. If you want to go to the next slide, and then the next slide. Okay, so I want to tell you just a little bit about the museum, which you see a picture of it in the bottom right-hand corner. The Anacostia Community Museum was founded in 1967 and has a long history of making community engagement a priority. There is, quite frankly, a lot written about the legendary founding staff of this museum, and they really helped to invent what it means to be of the community. And we are also one of 19 Smithsonian museums to focus on, or one of the 19 Smithsonian museums, but we're the only one to focus on current day social justice issues in our home city, Washington, D.C. So we are very much a city museum also. So when I became director of education here and the pandemic hit, I think our focus as a museum, with our history of being of the community, put us in a good position to take our work beyond the walls of the museum at a time when it was literally unsafe to invite visitors indoors. And we began to think about the city of Washington, D.C. as a part of our museum. And that was really exciting. So you can see here some of the projects we embarked on, which I'll get into more detail later, but just the spirit of the mindset, the subscription box for an adventure around the city. We have outdoor exhibits, an app for a walking tour, and of course our street team in the left corner, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So these 5 people represent one of the best experiments I've ever been a part of. These are the activators, which is our museum's street team. They are educators, of course, but they are many other things too. They are really creative people. They're spoken word artists, they are poets, rappers, singers, actors, performance artists, and really all of these talents come into play when we're trying to find innovative ways to bring the museum to the people. And just a small bit of history for you, the idea of having a street team actually coincided with the rising popularity of hip hop music in the 1990s. Fun fact, in those days, only smaller record labels were signing hip hop artists, and so their audiences were not really reachable through typical marketing tactics. And so these labels found it more effective to just hit the street, promote their artist, sell CDs out of their back trunk, street corners, record shops, and that sort of thing. So our street team is a little bit different. It has a little bit different purpose. We are a museum, not a record label. So we're coming to the streets with a little bit more of an educational purpose. But the idea is the same, to go out and find our audiences instead of requiring that they find us. Next slide for us. Okay, so you might be wondering, what is an activation? If we have activators, what is an activation? Well, just as the slide says, we're activating the museum experience in the world around us. We're trying to transform everyday places into sites of engagement, reflection, healing, activism, and informal learning. And just to kind of underscore what that really looks like in practice, I'm going to play a video for you. This is, by the way, all our activators, when they do these activations, they also videotape them, and then we put them on our Instagram feed at Smithsonian ACM. So they're reels. These are like TikTok videos, only on Instagram, about 1 minute long. So you can go ahead and play that.
Berry Farm, Hillsdale, the once segregated community that we now know as Anacostia. Until the 1950s, Morris Road was the area's segregation line, with black businesses thriving to the south and white businesses to the north. If segregation still existed today, think about it. What would you lose? How would you feel? At the Open Streets Festival in Anacostia, we set up shop right at the intersection of MLK and Morris Road. We wanted to find out what people knew and how they felt about segregation in the very neighborhood they walk freely among today. We set up this black door in the middle of the sidewalk to represent this idea of crossing a threshold and from one side to the other, and to start conversations. It worked. We found out that many people notice segregation still infiltrating their communities, explicit and implicit. Even with that old segregation line unmarked and unseen, the door to freedom still feels closed for many in and around Anacostia.
Great. Thank you. So you can see, actually, it was the activators' idea to represent segregation using an old door that they found at a junkyard, and they painted it black, kind of representing that feeling of crossing a threshold. And it really did work. It also presents something in a public space that doesn't look like it belongs there, so it kind of attracts attention. And so we had a lot of great conversations. That is an activation. Next slide.
And so our collaboration really started and centered around this question: what if students became activators? That's where our story starts. What kind of learning might students have if they tried to plan and launch their own activations? What knowledge and skills would they build? And how could their teachers support the process? So Capital Experience Lab and the Anacostia Community Museum, we linked up to try to answer these questions together, not just in theory, but in practice by actually doing activations with students. It has been a blast collaborating with Andrea. And so before we go on to the next slide, I just want to pull back the curtain a little bit on how she and I met and started to collaborate as a way to encourage both teachers and museum folks out there to make those connections. First connected with Andrea through an online forum that I found on Free the Museum's website. I reached out totally cold to ask for support when I was planning a student experience at the Eisenhower Memorial here in DC. Then I reached out again this past February after I saw an introduction to the activators' work on the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum's Instagram. The activators were busy, so it was a no. We couldn't link up at that time. They were busy in February. But then in March, Andrea reached back out to me about a new chance to collaborate with the activators, and that's what led to the experience with the fifth graders that we're about to share with you. So my encouragement to the educators out here is to share your interests with the museum folks who are in your area. Your first try, your interests might not align right away, but eventually the opportunity to work together could emerge. And as we hope you'll see today, you don't have to have a museum partner to do an activation. You and your students can do it by yourselves, leveraging your own creativity. And if you do have museum partners in the community, it can add both depth and fun to your experience to go ahead and do that collaboration. So just wanted to share that story to encourage folks to go ahead and make those connections. Andrea,
I just want to say that I think the collaboration between schools and museums is kind of like a Reese's cup. It's like chocolate and peanut butter. It tastes so good together. It's like a magical combination. And especially because we found an organization within a school that really believes in the same, we had the same mindset. So it was kind of a great match.
Thanks. We can go to the next slide because now we're just excited to share the steps that we took so that today, after today, you will be able to challenge your students to create a public-facing activation of a community space. And to start, in order to get there, we need to backwards design like teachers always do. We need to start with a shared understanding of activations, what they are and why people do them. So Andrea will give that to us from her perspective as a museum professional. She'll explain how museum professionals think about the benefits of activation for reaching the public. You share the next slide, please. And while she's sharing that, we invite you to use the Q&A box to predict some ways that students might benefit from these activations that Andrea is describing. And then we'll come back and process some of what you all have shared about those connections after she's done sharing from her museum perspective.
Yeah, this is going to be good. Yes, I can't wait to see what everyone is brainstorming because what I'm going to show you, these examples don't include students. So you're translating in your mind, what if students did something like this? Of course, some of them are going to be too outlandish, too much money involved, right? But it's the spirit of it that I want you to keep in mind. So next slide. So these are 5 benefits of doing this kind of work. So this is number 1. I think the most important benefit is context. Context is everything. If you think about it, what students learn in school and actually what museums do as well is teach people out of context. So if you see Abraham Lincoln's hat in a museum, it's away from where it used to be, where its context is, and there's so much information around that, right? So this is an example here where a group concerned about climate change decided to put these lifeboats in Vancouver up on these skyscrapers, and they were suspended just at the level that scientists had predicted that sea levels would rise after the ice caps melt. And wow, how powerful that is to see, just right in context how climate change will affect the city. That was done by this group called Rethink Communications in Vancouver. Next slide. All right, so Men of Change. This is another great example of context about how an exhibit that was meant to go inside a museum took on a very different purpose and had very different effects when it was placed outside in a neighborhood. And so let me just give you a little background. In 2020, our museum had arranged for the hosting of a traveling exhibition called Men of Change. It is an exhibition about African-American men, past and present, who have sort of altered our history and culture in a profound way. But by October of that year, you don't know where we were in 2020, we realized that the museum was just not going to be able to open anytime soon. So we embarked on this project to remake and reinvent the exhibit and reinstall it out in a neighborhood. And that neighborhood is called Deanwood, and it is in a section of Washington, D.C. that is often ignored, frankly, by cultural institutions and by city services. And as you can see from this map, we installed the various sections around this 2-block area where all those numbers are. I have actually a video to show you on the next screen, on the next slide.
Welcome to Men of Change, Taking It to the Streets, a powerful exhibition presented by the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. My name is Christian Johnson, and I'm a proud Washingtonian, a graduate of Ron Brown College Preparatory High School, and a freshman finance major at the Howard University. As a young black man in America, I see more negative images depicted of people who look like me than positive ones, and the ramifications of that can be perilous for black men and boys. When we tell our stories from our own perspective and share them with the world, it creates possibilities for us to authentically connect with people from all walks of life at a deeper level, and it helps us better understand the common bonds of our shared humanity. Men of Change does just that by providing a valuable platform for revolutionary, powerful, loving, brilliant, and creative black men to share their stories. Join me for a walking tour of the Men of Change exhibit at the Deanwood Community Center and Ron Brown High School. Throughout the tour, you will hear from students as they share their personal accounts of which men of change resonate with them. The exhibit features inspirational stories of 24 historic and contemporary men of change and is curated under 7 themes.
All right, so this is just a clip from actually a video of a walking tour, like a video walking tour that we made. And the purpose of it was to share the exhibit with 1,000 incarcerated men in the DC jail who were having a really profoundly bad experience during COVID. And so we wanted to bring the exhibit into places that it wouldn't have been if it were in the museum. It was kind of like this pandemic created the creative constraint that made us, think about where else could we be with our museum. So actually, if you could go back to the last slide.
And just while you're showing this, Andrea, I'm just seeing that the connections are rolling in from the teachers who are thinking about how students can benefit from empathizing with people in their communities, applying their knowledge to the real world, building connections across generations. So we're seeing the parallels right away already in terms of what students can do when they're creating these types of activations.
That's great. And Alison, you took your students to see Men of Change, and I didn't even know you then, right?
Yeah, I was able to go. First, I went with a mentee who was in high school. He and I were on a mission to scope it out to see, one, I wanted him to see it as a young man, but also we were scoping it out to see if it would be a good place to take younger students. And then I was able to go back with groups, again, before we knew one another, but it was an opportunity to do some of that learning when museum spaces were closed to the public due to safety, but we could gather safely outside. So we were benefiting from it.
That's so great. I love those stories. We actually got to be the only Smithsonian exhibit open, I believe, at that time, outside of the gardens. So that was special for our very small museum that doesn't usually get the spotlight. But back to the idea of context. So what does it do when you take a museum exhibit and you put it, and it wasn't made for outdoors, right? Like if I had to do it for outdoors, I might have done it slightly differently, but it has this dialogue really with the place that it's in. That's what we found out that was so interesting, is that, there's sections of this exhibit that had themes, so you had storytelling, you had community, you had myth breakers, I think it's called. And so we placed these sections where they made sense in the community. So we put the community section next to the rec center, and we put the myth breakers section next to Ron Brown High School, which is a school for African American boys who are, in fact, myth breaking all the time. And we put stories, the storytelling next to the library, so it just really matched perfectly. But then also there's the time period, which is also part of the context, which you don't think about. But what does it do when you put an exhibit about a very positive exhibit about African-American men in a predominantly African-American neighborhood in an era of racial reckoning. You know, we put this in February 2021, and you know, the country was really in the throes of grappling with, you know, what kind of world do we want? You know, what kind of racial relations do we want? And so to see positive faces, we did a lot of evaluation around this, and we found that the effect of having a Smithsonian exhibit in the neighborhood had lots of effects that it, you know, we just wouldn't even think to measure really if it were inside the museum. Usually you think about, like, what are people learning, and, you know, how many of the men did they connect with, that kind of thing. This was more about the overall impact, you know, as a whole, what is it doing to this neighborhood? So people found that they had more positive images of the neighborhood because this was there. They had more positive images of African-American men because this was there. They also said that even things like the city picking up trash in the neighborhood occurred more often because this was there. So just really interesting that relationship. Okay, next slide. Oh, by the way, you can actually rent, we created this outdoor version, and now the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibit Service does rent it out. So you can have it in your town. Okay, number 2 benefit. You can see the invisible stories that exist everywhere. You know, so a lot of times we're walking by the street, you know, on the street, and we don't even think about what had happened here. And actually, I just love the reframing here too of this particular picture, where, you know, you walk by weeds coming out of the sidewalk all the time, but if they're positioned as resistance, you know, that makes it a little bit more interesting. Okay, next slide. So speaking of invisible stories, if you live in DC, you know that it is a town that has experienced a ton of gentrification, and we have problems with affordable housing, big problems. I think, if not the worst in the country, probably top 5. And we're really, in some ways, the birthplace of what was called urban renewal back in the 1950s, which was this like government-sponsored kind of gentrification. And so we realized that in Southwest, where urban renewal first occurred, the Southwest is a neighborhood, that really almost nothing in the neighborhood was still there from when it was, you know, this neighborhood existed pre bulldozing, basically. And so it's kind of our mission to bring back the culture, flavor, stories that had disappeared. And we did this through building an app called Before the Bulldozers with this company called Walking Cinema. And what they do is really unique because it's a story that unfolds. It's kind of like an audio book that, you know, you're walking to, and then you can hold your phone up, use the augmented reality feature, and see photographs that kind of bring back that flavor and that the sights and sounds of old Southwest. And we allow people to grapple with gentrification while they're listening to that. So that's coming out very, very soon, Before the Bulldozers. Okay, next slide. Okay, another great benefit of doing these things outside or in communities is that you can bring the community together. And that's one thing that actually museum exhibits sometimes do too. But it's different when you're going into the place where people are just normally going to the bus, going to walk their dog. You know, these are different spaces than when you require people to kind of assimilate into a museum environment, right? So this is an experiment. This is kind of one of my first experiments in doing an exhibit. This is actually before Men Have Changed. This is my house. There's my house. This is a very ugly chain link fence that's right next to our house. But during the pandemic, during lockdown, I was trying to find ways for neighbors to feel like we were all kind of going through this together. So I gave 7 of my neighbors these wooden boxes, and they created dioramas in them based on what they had lost or found during the pandemic so far. So we called it Community Lost and Found. And then those are my neighbors in the picture in front of my house. People are like going to go to my house now. You don't need to. It's just a blue house in DC somewhere. There's also these tags on the fence that people were leaving of things whether they had lost and found. And those were really amazing because you could really see neighbors' voices, people that I had never met or talked to. I felt a kinship to. This woman, left one here that you can see that her father died. And there were several like that. We are losing things together. Other people, posted things that they lost that were positive. They said, I lost a bad relationship, or I lost shame, or something like that. So it was really interesting to see how we were all experiencing this in the same way, but in different ways, if that makes sense. And these neighbors who were the artists in the boxes too, that really brought us closer together, these 7 people. So next slide.
And teachers who are listening, you can keep in mind and keep using that Q&A to share the connections that you can see to the school setting and how students might benefit. We have some people who shared that students can apply media skills as they're maybe building their activation. And then this idea of building relationships with other people in their community. So thank you for continuing to think about the parallels and how these same tactics can help us at school.
So this next one is great too for students to think about who actually creates or tells the stories in history. Changing who decides what history is or who tells, what stories are important enough to put in a history book, right? And I know that when we did this presentation in the 5th grade class at Center City Charter School, I talked to the students about who writes your textbooks, who are the people that decide, well, we're going to put this story in, but not this story, or what are you required to study as a 5th grader in social studies? Who decides that? And I could just tell by the look on their faces that they'd never really thought that there were people, that do that deciding, but in doing kind of some of these streets, this is an example of what I liked, what has been known actually in, public art for a while as guerrilla. Guerrilla labeling is what this really is, where there was an artist, Lily Goodspeed in Philadelphia. She has this project called Plaque to the Future, where she creates these historic markers that look exactly like, a place that has been decided as a historic preservation area or site. And she puts stories on them that are very much outside the norm. So for example, this one is called Street Couch, and it tells a story of how these 2 roommates were trying to get their couch, they were moving and trying to get their couch down the stairs and onto the sidewalk, and they end up having to cut off parts of the couch in order to get it down the stairs. And then they got so exasperated that they just sat there and on the sidewalk on their couch and just talked about, hey, this was a good year and this was a good couch, That's just not a story that would really make it to the history books, but it's such a human, interesting story. And to walk by that and go, oh, this happened here. The couch was right here on this sidewalk, and these 2 people did this. And, on the sidewalk every day, people laugh and cry and need each other and fight and, all the things that people do. Right where you're just going to get going on your way to the 7-Eleven or something. So, okay, next slide. Okay, the last one I'll say here, and there are many benefits, but the last one that I'll talk about here is access. Because when you have a museum, you have to rely on people coming through the doors. And not everybody feels like museums are for them. And that is an unfortunate fact, but we have geographic issues. We have issues of culture where people are just not brought up in museum environments, or that they think museums are a colonialist sort of influence, and they don't think that that's a place that includes stories for them. I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? So when you're out in the community, it changes the power dynamic. You're on other people's turf, and so what they say about what you're doing is actually, more important than like a curator's voice or whatever. This is just a really quick and short example here, and I wanted to show you this photograph because it's the whole thing is made with chalk. Like, it's just pennies to do this, right? A piece of chalk. But this is my child, actually, and we were doing a lot of talking that day about how long animals are, and kids are really fascinated with size, and that creates a lot of wonder and awe. And so we drew this line on the sidewalk that says, "This is how long a tiger can be." And not only was my child really enthused about it, but so many people stopped by and were like, "Are you serious? A tiger can be that long?" And they, were getting down on the sidewalk too. And, saying like, "Well, does that include the tail?" There was just a lot of conversation. And again, not just access, but also community interaction too. But this was just like right on the way to work for people, so they didn't have to go in the doors anywhere. All right, next slide.
So a lot of you have already made connections and shared them in the Q&A box about how students can benefit from both participating in, but then also creating and designing and launching these activations themselves. And I just want to recap 4 of them, some of which you have already highlighted in using the Q&A feature. But number 1, getting out. Getting out is fun. It's something to look forward to. It's enjoyable. It creates a memory that you can reflect on, that becomes fuel for writing, for meaningful discussion. And Andrew might have some more to add about that. Do you want to share now about the benefits of getting out?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was really surprised, too, when we went to the 5th grade class. We asked them, how many of you have been to U Street, which is the street that we were going to do the activation on. It was about, I guess, I don't know, maybe 3 miles away from the school. And none of them had ever been. And it's a very popular area in DC. So I said that to Alison, they have never been to U Street. And she said, "Yeah, that's why we do this." And I was like, yeah, totally noted. Mm-hmm.
It's great to get out. So getting out is a benefit in and of itself and allows for that in context review of the content and some real deep thinking if you're strategic about what writing and discussion you build around the experience. Second, you have a real audience. That is motivating. It's motivating for adults. It's also motivating for children. We're always trying to help them build their communication skills and show them that some of the exercises that we have them do in the classroom serve a purpose. Activations leverage that because the whole point is to connect not just with the teacher or even just their peers, but to reach folks in the community with their message. Next, there's built-in room for voice and choice, which is also motivating. When we're asking students to come up with their own activation, we scaffold by providing some. In our case, we provided some documents to help them research and provided different tactics for students to choose from. But within that, they had freedom to figure out what they wanted their message to be, what invisible story they wanted to highlight, and then how to share that with the community. And that gave them that sense of ownership and agency that we're always looking for as teachers. And then last but not least, opportunity to control the narrative. As Andrea was talking about, we have sometimes this mindset when we're in school that we're receiving the way things really are. And this activation process lets students in on the process of shaping what people in their community know about and pay attention to, puts them in the author's chair. And that is something that we really valued about this experience together. Go ahead to the next slide.
You know what, before I wanted to address a couple of the other questions I saw here too that relate to, Men of Change. I don't know what material was used because Capitol Museum Services did it, but I have learned a lot about materials in doing this. For example, stickers that are made of vinyl, you can take off and on and are generally weatherproof, whereas stickers made of paper are not, things like that. there was also a question about, is the video available in its full version? Yes, on YouTube. If you search Men of Change Taking It to the Streets and our museum name, it should come up, hopefully. And how was the information about the impacted neighborhood gathered? We did a series of surveys. So we actually hired an evaluation organization within the Smithsonian to do street interviews, and they also interviewed all of the community partners that we had, which were quite a few, to understand what their experience of it was. So that is like a 50-page report that is a pretty awesome, rich information. Is there anything else?
Before we jump ahead, there is a really important question, I think, especially as we think about students doing this, where someone asks if we get permission from municipal authorities before doing this. And I want to say it depends. We're going to talk about this more later when we get into logistics and navigating all of that. If there is a partner to contact to be involved, we definitely reach out and contact them, and we make that transparent to students. It doesn't have to be something that's happening behind the scenes that they don't know about. Like, we open that up because that's part of the learning process for them. At the right age, they can even be involved with making the phone call, sending the email to get the required permissions involved. But sometimes, like the street team has done a book giveaway in a neighborhood of DC that's called Columbia Heights. I don't know, Andrea, if you got permission to do a book giveaway, but that's something, like, if I were to do that around the corner from my school, I wouldn't necessarily ask permission to do that book giveaway. So I think it depends on the context of what students are trying to do. It's not like built into the idea or the concept that you have to do this without permission. That's not the case. But we do want to build partnerships when that's available to us, and also say to students that there are public places that you can be in and talk to people, and that is okay. And no, that's a part of living here, and you're able to access the people around you without needing to ask anyone to talk.
We generally stay on in public areas, public streets, public sidewalks, public memorials, things like that. But like legally, like there are things that you can do, like projections, for example. And I guess certain cities have different rules about that, but in DC, it is not illegal. You can project on anything you want. I mean, even if it's not yours, as long as you're located on a sidewalk. However, it's not that we, being a museum, especially, we're not trying to be rogue in that way. We're trying to, like, if we're going to project on something, which we have before, we projected on buildings, we want to reach out to that building and say, hey, we'd like to do this, and we want to involve you in it, so that can be a relationship, like Alison said. And then one last thing before we go on, I wanted to address, somebody said, please address how we can ensure ADA approaches as well. And I thought that was a really good question. Every street corner is different. And so that would definitely need to be something, I would scope out beforehand. But as I was reading that question, something occurred to me, which is that ADA law is built into urban environments, right? It's in like the signage and the ramps and right, everything. But it's never interpreted. And that would be an interesting thing to activate, to show people like what is actually baked into, how does the government show up on the sidewalk, because it maybe is not how it should be, right? And so that could be an act of activism in a sense. I guess we should probably go on, huh?
Yeah, thanks for that. We are really appreciating your questions, and some of them that we can't get to right now, we'll try to share answers later via social media. So thank you for your engagement, and we hope to keep hearing from you. But really, what you already know, after hearing all of this about how museum folks do this, you can go ahead to the next slide. You as educators who chose to come to this session, media specialists, all of you who believe in young people, you know that students can do this. And your role, you can go to the next slide, as a part of the community of adults who support students, like your role is to help it happen. And that involves logistical work and instructional work, because you might be thinking about some of those questions, like the permissions question, or the transportation question, or the materials question. You're going to do some logistical planning for this type of project. And you'll also do the instructional work, thinking about how can you help students understand what they're being challenged to do, what resources can you provide them so they can build their background knowledge, what kind of language stems can you offer so that they are prepared to express their thinking in a way that is clear and also helps you meet whatever academic goals tied to the standards that you and your classroom are trying to achieve. We'll go on to the next slide. So we want to invite you into this process by sharing the story of the fifth graders who activated 2 sites here in DC. And we hope that you can use this to get a little more clear on what could this look like in the classroom. And we know that you are all going to be able to see all sorts of ways why what we did will work or would need to be changed for your particular context based on the age of your students, the content you're teaching, their specific needs. We know you're going to take this and go way beyond what we've done, but we hope that this first example can get your thinking started and show you an example of what's possible. You can go to the next slide. We used a 3-day process to achieve this goal. We wanted students to activate 2 sites. I'm going to share a little bit about the first site, and then Andrea will share about the second site. These are 2 sites about 3 blocks away from one another in a neighborhood of DC. The first site, which you can see on the screen, is the African American Civil War Memorial. There's a beautiful sculpture right when folks emerge from the DC U Street Metro stop. You can see it photographed here. Sculpture is called The Spirit of Freedom by a Black sculptor named Ed Hamilton. And all around the sculpture engraved are the names of members of the United States colored troops who served during the American Civil War. So this is a community space that invites us to remember and honor people who fought during the Civil War as part of the United States colored troops. So first goal, students create some type of activation related to this site. Second site, Andrea can tell you more about on the next slide.
So the second site came up when we were studying the first site. So we're looking at, because context, right? So we've got this memorial about the colored troops in this area of town called the U Street corridor. And it's has a long, illustrious history of being this like center of Black culture. It used to be called Black Broadway at one point. But we were wondering, what did this place look like during the Civil War? If we're talking about the Civil War, and these are the colored troops, what was this place like? And it turned out that it was essentially rural at that time. But there was one military camp called Camp Barker. So they had built this one camp. Well, I mean, when kids hear camp, they hear tents, but it's actually buildings. But what had happened in 1862 was that the DC had passed its own Emancipation Act. And so slavery was illegal in DC. Well, right south of us is Virginia, where slavery was still legal. And so there were enslaved people who were running away towards DC. So just like tens of thousands of people coming to the city. And so the Union Army created these camps for all of those runaways. And it was a terrible circumstance. It was very unsanitary, a lot of diseases. But so it has a whole story to it. But this is Camp Barker, and it is now Garrison Elementary School. And so you would never know that, right? Like walking by Garrison Elementary School, you'd never know that right in that spot was this really important bit of history. That's the picture of it. That actually is supposed to be a picture of when Abraham Lincoln stopped by the camp. So we have 2 sites, both with lots of different angles and history. That's a difference, I think, in when you're studying something in a book, you're like, okay, Civil War, this is what happened. But when you're in a place and then you add Civil War, there's all this stuff around it that kind of comes to light. So we wanted to include both. All right, next slide.
And I want to add to our a little context to our story, and that why do we pick those sites? It's because we partnered with the classroom teacher who worked with the fifth graders all year long, and she actually picked the African American Civil War Memorial because it connected with the unit that she was teaching and the students had already done. So that's why we ended up starting there. And then in talking with the Anacostia Community Museum team, that's how I learned about Camp Barker, and we collaboratively made the decision to include that. So I think that's a good example of the Reese's Cup that Andrea was talking about, where the school had a goal, the teachers had a goal to investigate more about Civil War sites in DC. She suggested a commonly known site, and then with the museum expertise, we could put on something that was new and we could explore both. So our specific path to student activations involved 3 days. First day, we taught what an activation was. Andrea shared, and the activators were with us. Someone asked in the Q&A about if activators are staff or volunteers. Activators are staff. As part of their workday that day, they came to fifth grade and met the students, taught what is an activation, and then we modeled an activation. Andrea is going to show you a little bit more in a minute about how did we model that. And we introduced students to their challenge. We showed them the sites. We shared a little background information. We said, all right, it's going to be up to you guys to design and launch your activations for these sites. This is your challenge. Then on days 2 and 3, we gave them time and support to research and design what their activations would be. And then the third day, we got on a school bus and we went out and we interacted with the public, where students launched their activations, interacted with community members, got their feedback, and it really did have a celebratory feel. So we're going to unpack each of these 3 days a little bit more. Andrea, can you tell us about a little bit more about day 1?
Oh yeah. All right, next slide. So we talked earlier about this sort of the concept of guerrilla labeling, and the couch example was a good one. So in kind of applying that then to the school itself, we wanted to look at what invisible stories reside in this school, in a particular hallway, at a water fountain, in the nurse's office. I mean, full-on drama is happening, right? Kids' lives are unfolding, and they're so relatable, right? And so we created these labels that are kind of pre-made. Orange one had a certain, a prompt, and the blue one had a different prompt, and the pink one. By the way, those label prompts are in our resource folder, which I understand is having some issues right now, which we'll have to fix after this. But that's a template that you can use. So the idea was we gave students the kind of like examples of what kind of story are we talking about? We said, okay, we don't need it to be something that you would never want to share with someone, like something that's too personal, but you also want to be vulnerable, because that connection to emotion is key when it comes to museum stories and museum labels. You have to care, right? And feel something. So, and then they were supposed to take these and stick them in the school where the thing happened, where the story unfolded. And so I have one to share with you, if you want to go to the next slide there. Oh, we have a Q&A prompt. If there are any questions about this guerrilla labeling or this activation, just put them in the chat, or not the chat, but the Q&A. All right, next slide. All right, so I actually have a piece of audio here, and so this fifth grader is going to read her label, and you can also read along with it, and I want to make sure we've got the volume up pretty high.
The first day at this school, I didn't know anyone. I felt shy and scared. Last year, I was on video, and it was hard to come in this school for the first time.
Yeah, I felt that. So this girl was talking about something that's really probably a lot of kids were feeling right when she was walking in the front door of the school for the first time, after she'd been on Zoom for the whole year. And so if somebody else going by that spot could read that and sort of feel a kinship or relation with that label. I got another one for you if you go to the next slide. Okay, this is another kid It Happened Here. Go ahead and play that one. Okay. It happened here when we had a drill that a random person got into the building. We also sat there for about 2 minutes but then they found out it was a teacher and resumed class. Then all the crying and being worried stopped. I think he meant to say stopped. This really, this was powerful for me to read this, that to think that there was this drill that happened that, in this kind of day of school shootings that, but this kid was really vulnerable and brave to put this up there. And when he actually read it in front of class, there were so many kids in the class that were like, yeah, I remember that day, so, and that's the place where he was. Next slide. All right, what questions, or do we have questions about guerrilla?
Two at least that we can answer now. One is people said it's a whole day in a self-contained classroom or a limited time class period in an academic rotation. Basically, how do we structure the time to do an activation like this? In our case, we used what was the students' ELA block. So Andrea and I came to school. We were partnering with their ELA teacher, and we used the ELA block time. Over the course of 3 days. The third day, which was our trip out, we used pretty much a half day. We got on the bus at 9 and students returned in time for lunch at school. So we did have to adapt the schedule just as you might for another field trip. But days 1 and 2, we used the academic block time. I think that this, as teachers know, any project can be compacted or extended depending on what skills you want to build, how much scaffolding you want to offer. So there are ways you can be flexible with that. Another question about labeling in particular is if we, did we censor or screen any of the stories? We set some guidelines up front and gave some examples or non-examples of what could be appropriate or not. And so we didn't need to screen. I think that that came with setting the expectation, and then students met the expectation. I think you would want to make sure that you are reviewing anything before it gets posted. And we did have that process in place where the activator team or Andrea or me, we were reviewing labels before students posted them.
And had them write them on a different sheet of paper before, putting them on there. So we were kind of helping them come up with what those were. They wanted to know if they were vandalized. I don't know. I didn't see any evidence that they were vandalized, although I think they were only up for like a few days, perhaps. Because I did want to say, I think it's important to involve the kids in cleaning up as well. Because you don't want to, even if you're in the school or you're in a neighborhood, you may not want to actually leave those things in place or you might want to leave them in place for a certain period of time, like 3 months or, whatever it is.
I would say it was fun as an educator to hear later in the week some buzz that people had seen different ones around the building, and conversation continued in response to them. But Andrea had done the pre-work to find a label that peeled off easily. So after the week was over, we were able to work with the kids and get them down. But I was part of the team that helped return the environment to the state it was before we put up the labels. And I didn't see any evidence of vandalism in our case. It was a pre-K to 8 school setting. Many of the kids attend there that whole time. So I think that school also has a culture of respect for one another's work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I put a link in our Google folder to where I got the labels if people want to buy them directly. All right, next slide.
Okay, so just prompting you that as we continue sharing and we shift from this example of what an activation is, because really guerrilla labeling was a way for us to teach students at school, how might you activate a site they're activating in their school. Now we're going to shift to how we help them plan for and launch their public activation outside of school. If you have questions about that come to you as we're sharing, please use the Q&A for that, and we'll address as many as we can at the end. Next slide, please. All right, this gets at the time question, and honestly, I feel like this could be the components of your lesson plan or your project, your unit module plan, if you wanted it to stretch way out. I put the spring on this slide because you can make some of these things happen really quickly, or you could take several days to do any of these components. I know we try not to put too much text on a slide, but from a planning perspective, you could use this almost as a checklist. So we did go ahead and put them all on here. What we did with the students was, first, we scaffolded their choice of topic about the activation sites by providing a quick bit of intro information about 5 different lenses that Andrea and I had thought about ahead of time. And then we had kids choose with a team which topic appealed most to them. Second, there was some scaffolded research. Someone asked about what resources do you use to help students with research. You could go many different directions with that. We created a blend of teacher-created materials that was in student-friendly language with excerpts from primary sources. So for example, Andrea had pulled some text from a letter that one of the members of the U.S. Colored Troops had written, and that was one of the documents that students who had that focal point chose. Or one of the topics that students were learning about was about Frank Smith, the DC council member who helped plan for and create the sculpture. I had pulled a letter that he had written when he was a civil rights organizer in Mississippi, and kids had access to that letter. So because we were doing this over 3 days, we weren't teaching students like how to find those resources, but that's something that you could choose to teach if you were trying to get at that teaching standard. That's up to you and figuring out what is the skill that you're really focused on for your instructional purpose. Step 3, after they've built their background knowledge, this is 3 and 4 are really the creative heart and where you see kids get most excited. You're asking them to identify what is the invisible story that you know about. Now that you've done this research, what's the story that you think other folks in town don't know that you could tell them if you can just get their attention when they're walking by? Help students identify that invisible story. And then step 4, select the tactic and brainstorm what you're going to do. We offered students a set of tactic cards, and we shared that in our resources folder with you, which we will fix so you'll be able to access it. Some cards that gave examples of what might you do, what could tactics look like? Is it labeling with chalk? Is it in creating an interview question? Is it a giveaway? What are you going to do? And students chose from that and then brainstormed how they could use that tactic to convey their invisible story. Last but not least, students did all the planning, thinking about materials, scripting out their words, getting organized. And this is really where you saw a lot of their executive function skills come into play, and where both collaboration and leadership were really shining through. I got to know these students over just a short 3-day period, but it was incredibly fun to watch them work together to try to achieve whatever goal they had picked out. All right, Andrea, can you tell us a little bit more about what happened after we got there? We did this, we crammed it all in 1 day, and the next day we went out.
I can. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right. So the student activations, I think there were maybe 5 of them, 5 different, and we did them with groups, but you wouldn't have to necessarily, but we had 5 different groups. I'm going to show you this video of one group that wanted to look at this memorial as a piece of art. It was sculpted by Ed Hamilton. They were actually using something called visual thinking strategies that museums sometimes use to look at art or to help visitors look at art. So she's going through some of those questions there. So you can play that video.
The female face makes me think positive because she's got like a confident look in her eyes. But the male statue's got more of a serious, solemn look. So it depends, I guess, on where I'm looking, but when I look at her, I feel like a positive emotion. When I look at him, I feel like a little bit like a sadder, because it's more of a serious. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Statue was a really serious thing, and that when people keep walking by it, and then when we actually bring people to the statue, they actually notice how really important it is.
Yeah, I love her.
I'm not so sure, Andrea, if it was quiet on your end at all, but just, I think that the last part of what she says is so powerful. So she says, like, when you actually bring people to the statue, they realize how important it is. I just wanted to voice that over in case anyone had trouble hearing her.
Yeah, when she said that too, I was like, oh, she got that out of it. It was good. Because, so there's a couple of things happening here. First of all, talking to a stranger, that's hard. We actually did a lot of facilitation with, kind of helping to wrangle some of the adults, because that's a really hard thing to do. And then helping them form these questions to help people kind of give honest and earnest answers to these questions. But overall, they really achieved their purpose, this one, in getting people to look deeply at the soldiers' faces and to connect with the soldiers themselves. And they actually put those photographs of women soldiers from today to kind of prove a point about like that this could be happening today. So to also look at those soldiers. The one right next to it, Running for Freedom. Allison, you've witnessed this one being formed.
Mm-hmm. This was an example of how students took an idea from a tactic card and then size it to fit where we were. So there was an idea on a tactic card that said, run a 5K. And so we had a quick little discussion about how long is a 5K? Could we really do that? Like, no, guys, we don't have time. But they thought about where they were and how far could they run and what might that represent. And so they thought about, it was 3 boys who came up with this idea, and they wanted to run representing soldiers who are a part of the Union Army, members of Union troops. And they wanted to run to get people's attention because they knew that movement would be attention grabbing, which it definitely was when they did it. They wanted to reflect like that being a soldier was difficult and hard and required exertion. And so they felt like running was a good way to represent that. It reflected a challenge. And then there was this layer of, with some probing, it's like they could articulate that they saw that people who were a part of the U.S. colored troops were part of this whole movement running away from enslavement towards a country where slavery was not allowed and we valued freedom. So they had those different layers on it. And what we found with this one was it was one of the most successful activations in terms of catching the attention of people who were around. And a lot of other students wanted to participate in it as well. So it really brought a lot of joy and provided the motivation for the kids to read that primary source that Andrea had pulled from a letter from a member of the U.S. colored troops. So I think it's a good example of how there was the fun element, but it also motivated them to do some real reading.
All right, next slide. This one on the left was about, the kids actually researched what kind of food was served at Camp Barker, and then they wanted to ask people to compare it to food today. And they had a bunch of Cheetos and stuff like that out. But it did get people talking. They wanted to know what they were doing. And the students were right there on the site where the food, there's probably, if you did an archaeological dig, I'm sure you could find remnants of, forks and plates and stuff like that in the soil right there. There was a scavenger hunt where they got people to participate in finding clues, and then the clues together formed a phrase that was, and I can't remember what it was. It was something about, the freedom that they got coming to Camp Barker. But I think there was another one with the kid was selling merch. Is that right, Alison?
Yeah, that's a good example in connection to the person who asked about permissions, because he wanted to sell water bottles that had images and quotes from Frank Smith, the person who was responsible for creating that memorial. And then he did a little research and found it's national parkland. If you're not licensed, you can't sell. but you could give it away. So he changed his initial plan from selling merch to having a giveaway. And so he made some buttons with important images from Frank Smith's life, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee logo and other elements. And so it was basically like, learn about Frank Smith. He would engage passersby by giving them something. And then he would say, like, do you want to know more about Frank Smith? And then he would share a little bit about who Frank Smith was, how he was related to that memorial that we were standing by. That's another example.
Yeah, that was a good one. I wanted to address one of the questions here. Someone wants to know about how would we do this in a rural environment where places are really far apart and you might not encounter people. And that's a really good question. I think what I would focus on if I were doing a more rural environment is activations that are kind of self-guided, as we say in the museum world, where you wouldn't have students facilitating dialogue or conversation, but you might have them install something, like a small exhibit or places for people to provide answers to questions, labels, things like that. And then they could even, evaluate them. I mean, I know an activation a friend of mine did where they took like those flyers where you basically have the little tabs that you can pull off, like if you want to like mow my lawn, and she used them. She had like a dummy voicemail set up where you could call this number and talk about your experience during the pandemic, which was really interesting. And then it just went to this voicemail, so you didn't have to go out and actually collect the data.
Mm-hmm. Just adding on that, I think it's also, in addition to doing things that people can interact with individually, like you're describing, I think you could also challenge students to think about what are the places and times in the community that do draw a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Can we design an activation that fits there? Is it like after the basketball game lets out on Friday night? Do we want an activation in the parking lot? Do you want to put something where there is going to be a stream of people walking by? Depending on what students' purpose is, they may be able to find a moment, like a naturally occurring community gathering spot that they could make the site of their activation, just depending on what their goals are.
Yeah, church, wherever. Yeah, that's great. And somebody else wants to know if we provide support for educators outside DC. This is a good question because Alice and I have been talking about what does this look like going forward? What's the next step after this? And we did develop quite a few materials that you'll see in this Google Drive folder. But, I think we're talking about like, how can we scale this and how can we make this easier for teachers to do, whether it's providing these materials or collecting more examples. I will tell you, there's another resource. So I talked earlier about Free the Museum. So freethemuseum.org is this website that my colleagues and I made, which has a ton of resources. It has even like a little activation guide. It's not for students, but you could adapt it. It has the activation cards. It even has, we have a Pinterest too, Free the Museum on Pinterest. So there's just a ton of ideas that, just kind of to spark your imagination. All right, let's keep going. Next slide.
All right, so you've heard that Andrea and I think this is great, but what do the kids think? What's their opinion? When we asked for their reflections, both in discussion and in writing after the fact, I think we saw the impact of this in a couple of different categories. One is the way that students thought about the place that we went. And they really had a sense of connection and ownership over that space, I think because they had created something in it. So they felt it became special to them in some way. And that's reflected in what this student shared in his written reflection. He says, I would like to bring my family to visit. I would tell them about the significance of the statue and how it represents the 209,145 soldiers who don't have a chance to recognize themselves. This was a theme that came up, that students were interested in bringing others to this site. They had a sense of that there was something here that they didn't know about before, and they wanted to share it. Go to the next slide. Thank you. We also saw another category of student reflections about the activation process itself. In short, they thought it was fun and challenging, which is what, as a teacher, that's what I'm looking for. That's the sweet spot when we can get there, because I really think that's where a lot of learning happens. So here are 3 quick student pieces of feedback that they shared in their written reflections. And they did these with their classroom teacher after Andrea and I were not there anymore. So I think that also tells you it wasn't just, they didn't just write this to us because we were right there. First, I want to remember how we changed people's way of thinking. Earlier, some of you pointed out this is about civic engagement, a chance for students to build relationships across generations, student agency. I love this idea that 5th graders know that they changed how other people thought.
I love that. That just gives me all the teacher warm fuzzies, because, and actually that's what museums try to do. That's kind of like what I see as the difference between a lot of sort of school-born projects where the students are essentially making products to show what they have learned, National History Day or whatever. Those are, I've learned all this stuff and I'm going to put it in this, package to show what I've learned. But in museums, it's not just important to show what you've learned, but also that anybody else cares about it, that like you've created something that connects with another person, and that you've caused a conversation, or you've caused a different way of thinking, or, even to the point where, somebody decides to, their behavior changes and they make a more just and fair world. I mean, there's like all this goodness baked into that. And I think, when I was teaching, I felt like a lot of the curriculum that we were, that was, we were made to teach was centered around showing what the students had learned, rather than teaching them how to create a persuasive and sound and meaningful experience for other people, which would benefit them their entire lives, no matter what job they ever have.
And then these next 2, I think, are classic 5th grade. This tells you yep, these really were 5th graders. Other teachers should try it because it is something fun to do, but you also learn a lot of information from it. Great.
I love that.
And this last one really was my favorite. I had to think a lot. Because I think that we were able to strike the balance between giving students some information that was new, providing resources for them to learn at their in accordance with an interest that they had, but then we left room for a challenge for them to create, and that mix required a lot of thinking. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. When you are supporting the students that in an activation process, there's so many spots to scaffold and to make this more complex or less complex. You can think of it being on a dimmer switch, and it's really up to you whether you take on a part of the process or you leave it for students to do. And those decisions are going to be guided by your learning objectives, your standards, what you're trying to help students achieve through the activation. So teachers or students, for example, could choose the activation site. We chose in our case, but you can imagine a scenario where you had more time, you would have students research and propose what sites they wanted to activate. Teachers or students could choose the lens within the topic. Again, a lot of it comes down to time. If you have less time, you might want to offer a choice like Andrea and I did. Teachers or students can own more of the research process. And so it goes. Just remember, as you're thinking about this, you might want to start small where you do a little bit more of the scaffolding, but the door is open for this to be a longer term project where you leave a lot of room for student work and agency. And there's really a lot of room to do skill development through the process as well. Next slide. Andrea's going to share some hot tips for making this work well.
And I see we're running out of time. So using your why to help you determine where to save time or where to scaffold. What are you trying to accomplish? Like with the soldiers, it could have been that the teacher has that why already and says, our goal today is to figure out a way to get people to see the statue and honor these soldiers and really feel that. How do we do that as a whole class? Could be one. Extra adults are helpful, obviously, with this. With the activators were really key, but you could involve parents. In my experience, being in museums for a long time, you have to tell parents what to do explicitly. You cannot just say, show up and like supervise, but because they will be on their phones. So you have to tell them. Be prepared to help students talk to strangers, and then getting permission, as we talked about, builds relationships. Next slide. The tactic cards are on freethemuseum.org. There's 31 of them. So those are really awesome to get your gears turning. Sometimes I like to take 2 and combine them and see what happens. You know, like just pick 2 random ones and see if anything occurs. Okay, next slide.
We got your feedback that some of these resources are hard to access. We'll fix it. So thank you. But you can go here if you are a teacher and you need some ideas for how to get started. It can take you through step by step.
We really enjoyed our time today, and I wish we could see all your faces, but we appreciate you, and we hope to start a new dialogue. Could you just go to the next slide real quick? So you can join our Facebook group and share your examples on Museum in the Streets Facebook group. I should make clear that it is only mine and Allison's, not the museum's, but we just thought we would start some dialogue. All right, thank you for your time.